Hello and welcome back. Thank you very much for those of you attending here. Yesterday we talked about the renovation plan
du gouvernement Nicolas Hulot et Jacques Mézard
on the
sur le
energy
plan de rénovation
transition
énergétique. Je pense que c'était
that we're experiencing now. So we're going to
Ici,
be
on parle
talking
d'une
about
démarche
a different approach, very
complémentaire, très
innovative one at
innovante,
that,
qui
which will
aboutira à
lead
une
to
réglementation, mais qui est un lieu d'expérimentation, donc c'est assez inédit en France. Et donc, bien évidemment, les professionnels, l'Untec, les professionnels de la filière de la construction sont complètement actifs, proactifs sur ce sujet d'expérimentation, sur le fameux label E+C-. Avec nous pour en parler, Sylvain TEISSIER, qui est donc à votre gauche, qui est vice-président en charge de la RD, recherche, développement et formation continue au sein de l'Untec. Vous avez Alain MUSE qui était là ce matin pour un atelier, qui est directeur international des normes de construction à la RICS. Et vous avez Jean-Loup Boissou, qui est membre du Conseil du groupement des industriels prescripteurs, le GIP, et qui a en charge les relations et la communication externe. Donc le label E+C-, vous connaissez le sujet, mais ce n'est pas encore abouti, donc on a encore beaucoup de choses à apprendre sur ce sujet. Sylvain TEISSIER, on peut dire que c'est un référentiel pour consommer moins de carbone et dégager, générer de l'énergie positive. Ma question est très restrictive puisque c'est la définition de E+C-. Donc c'est un référentiel, c'est un label.
Bonjour, c'est un label effectivement. Donc l'objectif, c'est de permettre à tout le monde d'expérimenter. Ce n'est pas une réglementation. C'est donc une application volontaire pour tester ce couple réduction énergétique et également maîtrise des émissions carbone des bâtiments neufs construits en France.
Et bâtiments neufs, donc c'est pas ancien, mais c'est neuf logements, tertiaires, bâtiments publics ou progressivement ça ira sur les différents segments de marché.
Voilà, pour l'instant dans le cadre de l'expérimentation, ça ne couvre que quelques typologies de bâtiments. Donc les logements, maisons individuelles, logements collectifs, du tertiaire et puis les autres bâtiments. Tous les pas définis
but then the experiment might lead to something far more exhaustive. So what about the future now? This baby is just really making its first steps. So what happened to this label? This certificate is a result of a series of consultations over a full year in the building industries, all the stakeholders in this industry, representative of the industries, Untec to represent the economists of construction, so as to reflect on this new label, new certificate with a view to associating, to bringing together the players out there, focusing on the energy efficiency.
Donc le label est d'application depuis
so this certificate has now come into existence at the end of 2017, and with the experimenting phase starting, so leading all the way to the end of this year. So, and we know that within the space of 2 years, we'll manage to experiment, to draw sufficient experiment to experience insights with a view to really maybe extending these and widening up the scope. So we have Bâtiment Énergie Carbone, the website, bringing together all the outcomes of these experiments in every project that makes use of CO2 and energy. So both for general as well as technical insights, 700 housing, 120,000 square meter in the commercials. So and these will allow over 6,000 in social housing units. So this will give pretty good solid ground to this experiment. So let's not forget about all of these components. Alan News, you were participating into, you participated in fascinating workshops this morning, so you're in charge of the international standards of construction standards. Is there this equivalent of this label, E plus C minus, in your organizations within the 1,200 members, 150 countries? Is that equivalent?
Well, first of all, there isn't any international standard yet directly covering carbon assessment, but what we've done at the RICS is produced a professional statement for our members, which was published in November 2017, which we believe can begin to be applied on an international basis, although at the moment it's been written from a UK perspective. It's a really important subject, and it's one in which we feel that, again, hard metrics are actually key in making progress. So at the moment, many issues relating to carbon gas emission and greenhouse gases are related to the building regulations in separate jurisdictions internationally, and they tend to concentrate on operational emissions. We think in our whole life carbon assessment professional statement that we should gather metrics for embodied carbon as well, because that's such an important constituent of the carbon effect of most buildings and infrastructure development. So we've put down a methodology and a staged reporting process whereby metrics for embodied carbon and operational carbon can be collected in a rigorous and standardized way. It's not an international standard yet, but it could become an international standard. I think also in answer to your point, Cyril, that the international standards we talked about this morning are obviously key interactions with that global assessment, that carbon assessment, because floor area calculation and in fact cost classification are both an integral part of the carbon assessment methodology that we put down in the professional statement. And by the way, the whole professional statement is based on the European standard that's already in existence. So there is no change in terms of the European concept and methodology for doing this. It's just that we've extended, it's just that the practical implementation of professionals operating that European standard, we think, has yet to be set down in a logical, structured and systematic way to collect the data that we need to collect to make the right decisions. I mean, for example, you could argue that putting triple glazing in the building would lead to lower operational emissions, but actually in an embodied carbon sense, putting triple glazing in is worse than putting double glazing in. So to using that simple example, it shows that these decisions that are made by design teams at the front end of construction projects need to be made with the correct information, which includes both operational information and which the building regulations generally cover, and embodied carbon information.
But from an operational standpoint, how do you work? There are countries like France with Untec and the players in the construction industries with the state and the E plus C minus. How does that feed into, how does that articulate? And maybe, if I want, what about the 150 countries, the 1,200 members? Do they all participate in the reflections on the certificates, or is this an experimentation that is being, because here in France it's quite unprecedented, because we can have a very directive role, if you like, and here it's not the case.
Well, first of all, we've got to establish what good professional practice is in this area and how that professional practice transcends professional boundaries. Where legislation is already in place in a mature economy, then clearly that legislation can encompass that standard. But in developing and emerging economies, we believe that standard is still relevant for professional practice. And if professionals begin to report in that way and gather that data, then it will lead to better decisions in emerging and developing economies as well. I don't think you necessarily need the legislation or the grading certificates to make this work. You have to use both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and I think the bottom-up approach is to get the professionals to report in a way that enables better decision-making.
With the deadline for France, the 2020 regulations is their deadline in terms of what you have scheduled for RICS as to a deadline and objective in terms of date to deliver, by which the results of this one-life carbon assessments for construction label could be delivered in terms of the 2020 date in France, which is the deadline.
Oh, I see, yes. Well, the professional statement that was published in November last year is actually effective from the 1st of May this month. So we expect our members to use that professional statement. And may I add that when we talk about a professional statement at the RICS, we expect that there will be various musts and shoulds in that professional statement. And the musts are regulated because we are a self-regulating professional body. So we obviously consider there to be a number of fundamental points in a report on carbon assessment, which we will monitor in terms of a professional organisation and expect our members to report in that way. So in that sense, as a professional body operating in this area, we certainly expect our members to comply with our professional statement. The challenge, of course, as we've already discussed, is with international standards, is gaining that wider adoption in the marketplace.
So more sustained, more adopted. So would you like to show us a few slides, Alan Hughes, if you would like to?
Sure. This is just a bit of background about the professional statement that I've talked about. So the professional statement covers the way to measure data through the whole project lifecycle, including, as I said, operational and embodied carbon data. It actually came about because we did an embodied carbon guidance note in 2013, which started the debate based upon some data collected by universities about how we could convert a cubic metre of concrete or a tonne of steel into the relevant embodied carbon emissions. So this professional statement builds upon the work of the European standard that was released in 2011 in terms of a practical implementation of that standard for professionals operating. And it allows, for example, cost economists to not only report on cost and using, for example, their own local standard or ICMS, but also to report on the carbon element at the same time. So there is no reason why a cost economist cannot report on the carbon emissions using this whole life carbon assessment tool at the same time as reports on cost, because many clients, as we know, and end users are beginning to demand this information. So the challenge is actually having a structured and systematic approach through the project life cycle to collect this data and to be able to report in this form, and that's what this professional statement allows our members to do. As I say, it's based upon the European standards, so actually we do hope, although it was written primarily for the UK market, that it becomes adopted in Europe as well, because we perceive, and I think it's accepted in Europe, that the practical implementation of the EN in 2011, it still needs further work, and if we can encourage professionals to capture and report on carbon in a consistent and standard way, then that will lead to, as I said before, better decision making in terms of projects and whole life carbon assessment. I mean, the professional statement looks at the global warming potential, which is a term that's used to, it's how much gas, how much heat a gas creates in the atmosphere or is captured in the atmosphere compared with carbon dioxide. So that common metric, GWP, or global warming potential, is the figure that's used in this reporting mechanism. And as I say, it also uses data collected from universities on embodied carbon and applies that also in the operational area in terms of carbon emissions during the life of the building. So it's a whole life approach to reporting on this issue from inception to post-occupation.
Thank you. Sylvain TEISSIER, what is the definition so far of positive energy building and negative CO2 negative, so CO2 minus? There are different levels of energy of CO2. Are you proactive in terms of Untec in France? As to this experimentation project and label project, in answer to your question, I suggest we take a look at a video, and I will do the voice-over. This is an extract from a book that we developed on these energy CO2 energy certificate, grading certificate as to jobs. So this is an experiment, and several levels are. So we have several levels, and every one of us can submit a project to a given level. So we have 4 energy levels, and these are gains in terms of the regulation, French regulations on new build, what we call the RT 2012 regulation. First 2 levels are gains that we come across quite often, and then from level 3 and level 4 we include a production of renewable energies with a view to resulting in a positive energy building, producing as much energy as it consumes, and it is for everyone to test their building. So we have 2 carbon levels. So these are broken down in 2 parts. In every CO2 levels, we have carbon 1. We have the first step for construction and building equipment. So we run an analysis of life cycle on these products. Over and above this, we'll have the energy consumption. Very good, and we check if we get and if we comply this carbon 1 level. Same applies for carbon 2, expressed in CO2 kilos per square meter, and from software delivering the life cycle analysis. This is extract from a book on ACV. This is the extract of the book when we discuss the label.
Ça, c'est issu d'un MOOC sur l'ACV, d'ailleurs, sur l'analyse de cycle de vie que vous éditez.
So that brings together the E plus C minus label with the theme of this Congress, the life cycle analysis. It's you bring together both aspects, right?
Quand vous construisez un bâtiment, conciliez les deux.
What seems to be most interesting in this label, and what will become a regulation, it is this life cycle building. So we have a life cycle analysis over a period of 50 years. It's it's interesting to project these a reflection over such a long period of time. And when it comes to building, to developing a building, so this energy analysis over such a period of time takes a significant share in the CO2 impact. So it allows to give some perspective, and as economists, there's this whole notion of global cost, total, global cost, and we're very, this is about widening up the scope of these studies. So the time unit is such that you have good understanding when it comes to surveying, and you're doing pretty good jobs, so you can phase this out for the first construction phases as well as maintenance and deconstruction phases as well. So you can bring together the label to see exactly how much CO2 you will consume as to these intermediate and final phases, over 30 and 50 years. As I said, the life cycle analysis is based on a standard, a very specific standard. We look at the full life cycle of products and building. So from impact of raw materials to the impact of manufacturing process of this carpet, let's say, its a lifespan, the construction and recycling and maintenance in between. So all these elements are taken into account in standardized data as part of what we call BEP for equipment, FDES, and BEP. So analysis sheet, very nice transition there. Jean-Loup Boissou, you represent the industrialists. And are you a stakeholder of this experimental perfection on this label, E plus, C minus? So indeed, we bring together 36 industrial operators and involved in the construction industries, and most of us are engaged in this voluntary approach in producing FDES or BEP, depending on the equipment and construction products. To give you an order of magnitude as to the few thousand, 1,800 sheets in the CNS database, the contribution of JEEP is in the region of 1/3 for 733 sheets. So you're delivering the FDES, these technical sheets, on the materials. This is what you contribute to. It's the clients. Well, we do this in two ways. This can be an individual sheet produced by the industrial player. It can be a collective approach as a result of a professional syndicate and bringing together a branch of, developing a branch of products. This approach was the first step in putting together individual FDES. They have a validity period of 5 years. Step 1 has been completed. We'll now focus on an individual approach for every industrial partners. So do you agree with the clients on the technical content? Well, this is French standardization agencies standards. So there's a very precise standards at the national level. So there's been a consensus to standardize the criteria, and then from that on, we can just complete these. And this is CSTB certified in the ENES database. So you provide 1/3 of the ENES database. We contribute to the tune of 1/3, and the other 2/3 are contributed by other sources. As you always have the, as a client always have the data on materials, while these are our members from the cluster, the grouping, and we are we want to stick to this and commitment going forward when it comes to the construction and permit and standpoints. So we wanted to be the pioneers, the trailblazers in this approach. We wanted to really focus on the local level to deliver these electronically, or they're part of the electronic modeling, mock-up, and we provide the certified elements, and these are hosted in the ENES database, and the service provider is the CSTB, and they uphold the proper deliverance or the proper issuance of sheets. Sylvain, how do you access that? Because we talked about a beam and digital modeling. There's real proactivity in France from a quantitative and qualitative standpoint. How does that get into the process? Well, there is a direct link between the ENES database that hosts sheets and the software. Some are compatible with modeling. There's a direct link. So you selected this market. These you'll find the sheets, and these will feed in automatically in the system. So as part of the experiment of C plus, so C minus E plus, we have objects that have been subject to sort of a check controlled by a third party. And this process has been developed since the autumn of 2017. And some of those sheets are not double-checked by a third party. So for the time being, we haven't access to all of the data of all the products that were on the database. This is an ongoing process, quite satisfactory to be involved in such an approach, as going forward this carbon data will play a role in sizing, designing, prescribing buildings, and it's important for these data to be 100% reliable and checked by a third party. Now, if we talk about phasing, anticipating, there can be an evolution in the building project in very constructive ways. In that case, you need to ask for updates if the materials has evolved, has changed. Yes, indeed, that is possible. It holds true for the insulation materials. We know how to manage it. We can manage that. The economist is not necessarily there to describe something as very precise. You need to give some leeway to all of the operators to submit their proposals within the framework of tenders. So this is a process that can control for many topics, and we'll know how to manage that from a CO2 standpoint. So you're happy with this data in terms of what they teach you from a very, could these be improved? It can. And what's interesting here, if I may point this out, is that the experiment result is that you design such a building, you get such a result, so see carbon 1, and maybe going forward, this carbon level will change, will evolve, because final data will be available, but you need to be cautious. And this, you have to, get into this experiment to achieve something that is as refined as possible, as accurate as possible going forward. So the point here, Jean-Loup, is to develop a virtuous approach as opposed to having something that's very constraining, mandatory. So you all have a personal responsibility as citizens, not only as citizens, but as companies. This is a commitment to the local authorities, which is an important one. So a voluntary approach is always better than something that's mandatory and regulated. This will then lead to something that's regulatory and constraining. Maybe people will respect this a bit more, in actual fact. If this is well accepted for industrial players you represent, is there not an arbitration at some point? Yes, I want to give information, but I don't necessarily want to give information because that will impact my sourcing strategy. Let's say that in terms of the information disseminated via the sheet, I actually, there's also the generic data modules when the FDS are not there. We have those the data published by the government. This is a kind of minimum standards, but to come back to this industrial logic, we must make progress and show goodwill and responsibility of everyone in the building permits and issuance. This will not, so it's participative. And so you feed into the administration, the ministries. We contribute. I think this experience, as a result of its pedagogy, will be far more acceptable than something that's imposed and with a deadline for enforcement. Now, if you compare this with the automotive industry at the start, and it was reluctance in getting into the environment. Now there's a huge market, but a few years back it was not at all there. They wished, they weren't willing. But in terms of this feedback of experience, we can think that there's a huge, vast market, even from a commercial standpoint. So building with E plus C minus grading certificate will be quality label, as in the food industry and automotive industry in terms of the electrical standards, right?
Indeed, it would be a real difference. It will show that we are responsible stakeholders, responsible players, and this is something quite important for the project managers and the users. Yes, indeed, the users, I don't know, might imagine for, well, during the life cycle analysis, the construction and so on, that there is a real commitment. The carbon footprint is around 150 years for a building, and it's about half of that for construction and so on. So everything that has to do with performance is important, and the more efficient the building is, the less, well, the smaller the carbon footprint will be. And I think that's what we have to take into account. It's a whole array of values, and that's really motivating because we are doing something that, well, I do think that the word responsible here was the right one. Well, we have representatives from the industry, from the profession, from an international organization. So all the stakeholders from the construction sector taking part in all this? Sylvain TEISSIER. I'm asking very naive questions, I know, but architects, engineers, project managers, are they all involved? Here we're talking about buildings for the moment, housing buildings. Maybe in the future we'll talk about public buildings, public facilities. Does everyone have an interest in taking part in all this? And I'll ask the same question afterwards to the rest of you. Well, during the consultation, I said that the entire sector of construction and real estate were present. That is to say also energy suppliers who have a lot of things to say. When you're supposed to calculate the energy impact in the 50 years to come, it can truly modify the business plan. So all the stakeholders were present during the consultation, and they will be again when we have to talk about the results of all this project and orientation. I know that's not something extremely common, and I actually agree with the pedagogical aspect of these dynamics. Not everybody agrees on what we're doing, but everybody agrees on the fact that we do need to experiment. Alain News, given the RICS's international scale, what's your point of view regarding the commitment of the stakeholders internationally when it comes to this label?
I think there is a strong understanding that this is a key issue for the construction and built environment, and I must say my experience with this professional statement was that construction stakeholders outside surveying and cost economics were very much involved, including architects, engineers, contractors, and in fact manufacturers and suppliers, and in fact governments and the people who are end users in the construction market. But I think I just want to say that they have to be, because construction is a team process, and we will not achieve the optimum solution without embracing all construction stakeholders. And I think also new technology allows us to embrace those stakeholders in different ways, and we've already heard about building information modelling and BIM objects, for example, that capture the carbon, the embodied carbon or the carbon emission of a particular product. And I think this is so important that the industry responds to this technological challenge, because the industry probably has to work in a different way to fully enable it. And by that I mean a more collaborative way of working, early supply chain engagement. To achieve the optimum design solution is one thing, but to achieve the optimum design and built solution is another thing. And to achieve the optimum design and built and asset management solution is a third problem. And the only way that you can achieve that optimum solution is to get all stakeholders working together. And in order to do that, you need to collect the data in a standardized way. You need to get the data. You need to inform decision-making with that data. And then you need to work together collaboratively to achieve that optimum solution. And that has impacts, by the way, all the way across the construction process from inception through to procurement, because the way we procure buildings, we often do it in a rather staccato, here is the design, give us a price way, and we really need to change that way of working in order to fully enable the technology that is becoming available in terms of building information and artificial intelligence, and actually also work together in perhaps a more collaborative way.
Merci, Alain.
I have a question for the three of you, but maybe Sylvain would be more interested. The buildings that consume the highest level of carbons are the oldest ones. Could we master that? Could we master what we're doing at the moment for old buildings? I think that would be extremely interesting, but then we have to consider the issue of data. Carbon, well, the data regarding carbon, how could we recover the data? What we're doing on thermal energy could be done with carbon emissions, but we need to create data. So there's a real work of engineering in order to find new materials and everything. Right. And we also have to define, generate data regarding, for instance, wall partitions or partitions made of stones and stone or wood, or but it is an interesting prospect, and it would be an approach based on collective intelligence, and we would address the major issue of climate change and therefore of greenhouse gases emissions by understanding very quickly what we're dealing with and trying to improve. So the next turn point is 2020. Is there any major step to overcome before that? Well, we're talking about 2020 or 2021, but really we have to make things move forward between today and 2020. We have to see the results of what we're doing. But then again, there isn't any certainty about what we'll find. Won't be surprised if a decision is made earlier than that. What's important is to experiment, to give ourselves the means to be able to work, and it's all about experimentation. We already have enough material to sort of lay the foundations for the next regulation. Earlier we talked about the BIM, about digital mock-ups, digital designs of ACV. We're talking here about digital innovations, new ways of working, and you mentioned that earlier. So you, in your action at the level of Untec, you're supposed to train people to raise awareness, and thanks to the digital words, you managed to put words on everything that you're doing and to create device with what you're doing now. Yes, the responsibility of the federations and the trade unions has to do with making people understand the impact of the regulation. This is something new that will spread worldwide. The idea was not to train economists, but really to understand how all this can influence our job and the rest of the sector. And this was one of our ambitions, and I know that we are committed to truly convey that knowledge. The RICS, does the RICS participate to communication campaigns with its members? Well, obviously, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But do you do training sessions with companies working with the RICS regarding these issues like life carbon assessment and so on? Or even issues that you mentioned earlier, like the BIM or digital mock-up, since we're right at the heart of a breaking point right now. So are you trying to train people, to train your members at the moment?
Absolutely, and I think that manifests itself in two main ways. One is we have an extensive CPD program, or continuing professional development program, for our members, where we keep them up to date with new practices, new guidance notes, new professional statements, new innovation in the industry. But secondly, we do have a training arm at the RICS, which actually is dedicated also to producing training that's of interest to professional practice, and perhaps wider than just surveying, in terms of executive management, etc. So through both those two channels, we have an extensive program of training, both in terms of sustainability and the carbon agenda, but also in terms of, particularly recently, in terms of building information modelling and new technological challenges, and how we make the most of that in terms of the public advantage.
Thank you, all of you, Sylvain, Jean-Loup. If you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, don't hesitate. Speak up. The lady will walk in the room with a microphone.
I'll do my question in English rather than franglais. My question is for Sylvain. You talk about carbon life cycle, and in your presentation, everything was calculated per square meter. So my question is, did you use the French standard? And if you did, how do you benchmark against other countries when there's up to 57% difference in measurement area for residential properties, depending on which standard is used? And the second part is, if you used it globally, how did you make for the difference between different countries' measurement standards?
You won't be surprised when I say that it is a typically French process. We kind of like that. I'm not the one that defined it. I'm just using it like many other stakeholders. And I do not think, not that I know, that there is something different that is in place, and the public authorities didn't try to do some research in order to get closer to what is being done elsewhere. Once again, this process was mirroring what had been already done with the RT 2012 for the energy transition, and unfortunately we are still applying international standards, but with a French specificity. Philippe Estingot, I would say, how do you position the sheets compared to the guidelines for the construction product at the European level, the other European products that could enter the market? Is there a specific attention paid to the fact that some sheets might have to be filled? And also I have a remark regarding the question, sorry Sylvain, but regarding the usage of the plus and minus and regulation. My personal analysis isn't that, well, we should do the analysis of the carbon footprint of what's been built already, but maybe because the price of the carbon has been paid already in terms of construction, so the elements that we're going to bring in for renovation work will have to be taken into account, and the results will be more positive when we try to calculate the carbon footprint here again. So the calculations might be different, but we won't have to pay a lot of attention to all buildings when it comes to carbon. But I'd like you to answer my question when it comes to the RPC. I don't have many elements regarding the comparison of the sheets between the sheets of foreign products and our products. I think here again, it should have to be studied by Bazinias in order to get some common elements, but I don't necessarily know the procedure that can be applied at the international level. Is there an association that can that exists at the European level? Caroline, I'm here on behalf of the construction material manufacturers. Obviously, there are environmental data sheets at the European level because we fill them in according to European guidelines. At the moment, they're still not connected to the RPC. It's on a voluntary basis in each country, and therefore in each country there is a program that we called the operational program that sort of manages, just like INEAS, the EPD of construction products and equipment. And we are part of a European association that allows us to exchange when it comes to good practices of products in order to have the same level of requirements and of quality. And more specifically, we have very good relationships with, for instance, the German, and this EPD that is declared for a product in Germany but that should be sold in France. We start with the technical sheet from Germany, and we ask for an adjustment to be made for the French market, for instance, transport licenses or end-of-life cycle scenarios that could be modified, and then we accept a sheet, a technical sheet that will be sort of adapted to the French market. And in our association, we are dealing with many foreign manufacturers that sell in the French market, and they see that there's an interest in relaying that kind of information. In the same way, we have groups that sell in different countries and declare that they're FDES in France, and they do other declarations in other countries according to the different modalities. So this is how it works. However, we are one of the most advanced countries because we have a lot of data, but we're talking here about digital data, so that can be directly integrated in the calculations. We have a web service that can help doing that, and that can be accessible to in the software. Could I ask my question? Yes. Now, regarding the life cycle of buildings, it's a question for Mr. TEISSIER. I didn't really understand how these figures were calculated, and now regarding your heritage buildings, I just wanted to say, well, your logic regarding consuming less energy and therefore emitting less carbon dioxide isn't just a typically French problem. It has to do with the entire planet. And therefore, I'd like to know how your method takes into account the issues of programmed obsolescence. For instance, I don't know, a carpet on which you walked has to be changed. But now, that's quite obvious. But now, what about the other structural elements of the buildings? We usually tend to say that elements should be changed every 50, 60 years. For instance, I don't know, for beams that are 600 years old, what can be done? The idea might not be just about calculating how much a building is going to cost, but how we could reconsider all this to have everything comply with your method. Here, it's not my method. I would have never been able to create it. I talked about 50 years, but it's sort of the average period of time. We're not going to destroy the building after 50 years' time. That's it. It's just a time study. Now, within this time study, the carpet indeed might last for about 15 years, and the wooden beams for much longer. So we're going to replace the carpet, but not the beams, because they're supposed to last much longer. You also mentioned programmed obsolescence. For the moment, each industrialist defines a scenario, a life scenario for each and every one of their products, end of life, recycling, and so on. And I do not think that industrialists are forced to consider this programmed obsolescence. This is something that we considered during the Congress. Basically, everyone has to ask themselves the questions. We all know that products are evolving, that the industry is making efforts all the time, and the idea is to deliver products that are even more efficient and interesting, and this is going to continue improving, will reach interesting carbon emission levels and so on. And I think that this is something on which industrialists will argue and question themselves, but this is not necessarily part of the SCV studies at the moment.
Mais qui, à mon sens, n'est pas pour l'instant définie expressément dans les normes d'études des ACV.
Sorry, can I come back again, Sylvain? Sorry to monopolise you with the questions. You mentioned that you were at an experimental stage, and earlier today you heard mention of ICMS. There is also an international standard for property measurement, IPMS. Bearing in mind your studies take materials from different countries, all of which calculate measurements differently, with wide variances in office, industrial, retail and residential measurements depending on which standard is used, an improvement for your study could be to adopt an international standard which would allow you to compare apples with apples or pomme de terre avec pomme de terre. And you might find that might help, especially when we're looking at this in a European context, because it is a European issue.
I'm quite convinced about what you're saying already. Untec already created a classification in order to be able to make the analysis of the building systematic. The idea is to put apples with apples, like you said, and pomme de terre with pomme de terre. Now, as far as I know, this wasn't at the heart or lengthy discussions, but and I'm sure that it will become necessary, for instance, with digital mock-ups, digital designs, and they will have to take into account environmental data. This is not today the right way to quantify everything. Today there is still a work of analysis that is done by human, but in the future, the digital mock-up will have to include environmental standards. So there's a real need for a classification of buildings. So the ICMS can also help what's happening in France, for instance, with the public authorities. I had a quick question. The FDS sheets take into account the impact of the product as soon as they exit the factory. Is there anything taken into account regarding the location of the building site and its distance from the factory? We talk about also a period of time of 50 years, which I hope is not the life cycle of the building, otherwise I need to change careers. And my question is, have you considered different stages? What do you mean regarding the sheets? I think that the expression and from the cradle to the grave, here, basically, you start considering the product from the moment it is manufactured until the construction. So all these parameters are taken into account and considered in the FDES. Also, I would add that some sectors, like the concrete industry, made configurators available. That is to say that you can get from all the data from a concrete wall, you can have access to more specific data. So here you can enter some data in order to have some data, in order to obtain data that will be specific to your project. The idea then is to compare buildings and result, and the thermal regulation imposes scenarios that do not necessarily comply with reality, but that doesn't really matter. The idea is that we can compare everything, and I think it could be extremely useful to keep all the data and to consider similar approaches when it comes to the analysis of these data. Regarding positive energy buildings, what's the scope? Well, if you want positive energy, you need a consumer, and a consumer can take the shape of several things, like electric vehicles that can be charged in the building. So how can the method consider the interaction between the building and its environment in the carbon footprint? From what I know, I'm not sure the method actually uses or even considers that there might be vehicles that will be charged. However, it knows about all the energy consumption when it comes to classic consumption, heating, lights, and so on. So, and they take into account other things like the use of solar panels, and it will take into account the fact that the energy stemming from these solar panels is going to be consumed. That's where we stand today. Maybe the method will be able to take into account all other aspects. For instance, if you tell it that you're going to charge your electric vehicle, but that's something at the moment that is not taken into account. We'll have to work on that. Anything else?
Actually, I was just going to go back to the previous point about obsolescence, because I think in terms of obsolescence, we need to be aware of as an industry that maybe we're moving towards a lesser design life, in some cases, particularly where prefabricated modular construction is involved. And also, economic obsolescence quite often occurs long before technical obsolescence. And I think the issue of using buildings in a hiring economy, if you like, is becoming something that we need to think about as the construction industry. I just mentioned that because I think it's always difficult to forecast the future, but the issue about obsolescence is a very traditional design life orientated approach at the moment, and I think that may well change in the next 5 to 10 years, so we need to be aware of that as well in terms of the carbon agenda.
Do you have any other questions or comments? Hi. The finality of the experiment has to do with the input of data in the E+C- observatory. Did you get some feedback regarding the cost effectiveness of this experiment? Well, Untec doesn't have access to all the data that's been input during the experiment already. But you have to be very careful when it comes to that, because all the data regarding carbon are quite volatile. They tend to change. Feedback, well, as you know, this is very difficult to draw any conclusions from the data that we managed to collect already. So I really don't have any figures to give you so far. not today at least, and I'm not sure, to be honest, that all the projects share their economic figures, economic data, because these figures might be sort of a touchy issue for in some projects. The idea is to be able to input and to supply the government with a certain amount of data.
Le cas échéant, pour aussi fournir des données voilà, au gouvernement et à toute la filière.
Thank you, Alan, Sylvain, Jean-Loup. Thank you very much for being here.